I'd like to wrap up this module with a few thoughts on some of the difficulties we've encountered along the way, not least when we came to study consciousness and it wasn't clear what the word meant. The general theme of consciousness is of relevance to a very, very wide variety of disciplines. So cognitive scientists, obviously, depending on how you use the word, neuroscience may or may not be relevant. Psychology may or may not be relevant, but psychologists have interests in this area, particularly with attention and awareness, which are terms of art within psychology. There's a branch of continental philosophy known as phenomenology, which attempts to grapple with the nature of lived experience, which is this close to what we sometimes mean by consciousness. Psychiatrists are very, very interested in it. They have a rather more differentiated view of what we discussed as states of consciousness because they meet a greater variety of states of consciousness. Psychoanalysis, not strictly within the scientific realm, but very, very interested in the nature of lived experience. And then there are links these days between scientific work and others who have expertise in this area, including various contemplative traditions. There have been very fruitful dialogues between Buddhist and Hindu scholars who have several thousand-year-old traditions of examining critically and discussing what we are loosely referring to as consciousness. Physicists may even be involved, and the great meeting between physics and cognitive science has yet really to happen. So, despite the fact that it's a very difficult word to tame, the inquiry is definitely worthwhile. And you may have joined this course, I don't know if you did, but you may have joined this course with the idea that science restricts itself to objective accounts describing things in the world. And consciousness is, of course, inherently subjective. It always is, by definition, subjective. Most ways you might choose to define it. So you might say, well, it can't be the topic of scientific study, but I hope everything you've learned in this course leads you to treat the terms objective and subjective with a bit more caution. The distinction is not simple, and being objective is a complex property. Both objectivity and subjectivity are very, very rich, complex concepts, and they can't be wielded ignorantly in argument. The subjective is necessarily of concern to us because if we rule it out of bounds, then we've said from the outset that science can have no relevance to questions to do with suffering, meaning, value, feelings. And I don't want to be associated with any science like that. Science is a human practice for human purposes. Objectivity and subjectivity are not simple, and we need, particularly in cognitive science, to be cautious in how we approach such topics. I'm going to wrap up with a few observations about stuff that goes beyond this module. We've run into various forms of embodied cognitive science at various points, but there is an emerging school known as enaction that falls within the broad field of embodied cognitive science that chooses to take a radically different stance with respect to the person, the organism, and the brain. And it's often known as mind in life approach. And the assumption here is not that consciousness is produced by brains. That's assumed not to be the case. But that consciousness is an expression of life. Consciousness is continuous with life. So that what we think of as human consciousness is just one way of being in the world that suits the kind of monkey that we are. But it sees this consciousness as not a purely human phenomenon, but something that all living beings have. That may be a valuable approach in the coming years as we negotiate our co-being with the biosphere in the context of planetary destruction, ecosystem collapse, species extinction. Understanding our place within the larger domain of life is very, very important. There's a couple of more or less recent books, not all very recent, that introduce this field if you should be interested. So consciousness was difficult to address, but what we did was we showed some aspects of it that have been amenable to scientific modeling and consideration. And also we showed how, as you think about it, as you address questions to do with consciousness, you make distinctions and you learn more about what initially is a relatively unformed idea. And I suspect that the scientific treatment of consciousness or experience or awareness is not just another topic. It might be the fundamental topic that changes our understanding of who and where we are in the cosmos. But it's early days yet. Science itself, modern science, is only 400 or 500 years old. You don't solve these things overnight. So one thing we've learned is that when we speak of the person, of experience, of ourselves, a lot of our words that work perfectly well in everyday conversation don't lend themselves to being pinned down very easily. And these include words which are absolutely central to the concerns of cognitive science. Mind was never defined in this module. Thought was never defined in this module. Consciousness, same. Perception, attention, memory. We didn't go into attention and memory because they are elaborated specifically within schools of the psychological sciences, which provide one approach. But what we've learned is that in any given context, when we have conversations about these kinds of topics, that conversation is built on some framing assumptions, some basic understanding of what it is that we're talking about. We're thinking about consciousness in one way or in another way, about minds in one way or in another way, about relational or representational approaches to perception, for example. Now, hopefully, having taken this module, you will become more aware of what those framing assumptions are as you see such topics discussed. When they are not recognized, when it's not recognized that we have a plurality of approaches to understanding ourselves, then that leads to misunderstanding. Becoming aware of how to conduct a conversation within these difficult fields can help to improve our discourse. If you like the content of this course, we have a master's degree in cognitive science. It's a 12-month taught master's program run by myself. It's jointly run actually from the School of Computer Science and the School of Philosophy. It is designed to be ideal preparation for those who are drawn to the subject because of intellectual curiosity. It's not a psychology degree, it's not a vocational degree. It is a suitable basis for those who go on to pursue research in the area. And it really only suits those who can mix their science with philosophy. So you need an awareness of both branches, as it were. At the start, in the first video, first topic, I suggested that you might spare a thought for the old alchemist. The alchemist is a figure of ridicule these days. Alchemists were chasing impossible dreams, the philosopher's stone, turning lead into gold, and probably a lot of that's not accurate, but this is the picture we have of the alchemist. But they were experimenters, and their work led to the development of, among other things, it led to the development of what we now call chemistry. So that before a well-defined science can emerge, there's often a great deal of groping around in the dark, of chasing ideas that don't pan out around. And perhaps cognitive science is more like in that stage than, for example, one of the more boring sciences in which things are clear. Well, I hope we didn't confuse you too much in this module, and I hope you enjoyed it. We've reached the end. Thank you very much for taking part in the module.